Ever notice how, like, some people just don't even seem to blink an eye in a super crowded concert,
Yeah,
while others freak out just thinking about, like, being crammed into an elevator?
totally.
Like, we all experience crowding so differently.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's what we're going to deep dive into today.
Okay.
That whole idea of what happens when things get a little too close for comfort.
Yeah, right. Yeah, when personal space goes out the window.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So we're going to be looking at this classic study
Oh, cool.
from way back in 1962.
Okay.
It was published in Scientific American. It was called Population Density in Social Pathology.
Interesting.
And the researcher behind it was this guy, John B. Calhoun.
Now, I've heard that name before.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, wasn't he the one who did all those crazy rat experiments?
Oh, that's the one.
Okay, so we're talking about rats today.
We are. But before we get into all the nitty-gritty of his experiments with the rats,
Okay.
we should probably start with a really important distinction.
Okay.
And that's the difference between density and crowding.
Ah, because they're not the same thing, are they?
Exactly. I mean, think about it like this.
Okay.
If you've got, say, 20 people all packed into a tiny room,
Right.
now if they're all like best friends having a blast at a party,
Right.
it might not even feel crowded at all.
No, you're just having fun with your friends.
Exactly. But then you take those same 20 people,
Okay.
same tiny room,
Uh-huh.
but now they're all trying to take like a super important exam.
Ooh, high stakes.
Totally different vibe, right?
Absolutely.
Way more pressure.
Like a pressure cooker.
Totally.
Uh-huh.
So same density,
Yeah.
completely different experience.
Interesting.
And that's kind of what makes crowding so fascinating.
It's all about perception then.
Yeah, perception, context,
Right.
all those things.
I see. And is that why Calhoun chose to study rats for this?
Well, there are a couple of reasons for that.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, ethically speaking,
Yeah.
you can't just like subject humans to that kind of intense crowding for, months or even years just for research.
Right, makes sense.
Plus, human environments are just so incredibly complex.
Uh-huh.
It's almost impossible to isolate crowding as like the full cause of any particular behavior.
Yeah, way too many variables.
Exactly.
Like trying to untangle a giant knot.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy.
So Calhoun went with rats then.
He did.
Man.
And he started with what he called, get this, a rat utopia.
Rat Utopia.
I know, right? So basically, he created this quarter-acre outdoor enclosure.
Wow, a quarter acre for rats.
Pretty sweet digs, right? They had everything they could possibly want.
Like what?
Tons of food, fresh water, all the nesting materials they could ever need.
Sounds luxurious.
It was. They were living the good life.
And no predators, I assume.
None. Completely safe and sound.
Wow, so like rat paradise.
Pretty much. He figured the population would just explode in those ideal conditions.
Right, unlimited resources and all that.
Exactly. But here's the thing.
Right.
It didn't explode.
It didn't.
Nope. The population stabilized at around 150 adult rats.
Interesting. So it wasn't that they weren't having babies?
Oh, they were having plenty of babies.
But,
But the infant mortality rate was just through the roof.
wow, really high then.
Shockingly high, yeah.
Huh, so even in this perfect little rat utopia,
Right.
crowding was still somehow having this huge impact.
It was, and that's what really got Calhoun thinking.
It makes sense.
Why was crowding, even in paradise, having this dramatic effect on their survival?
Right, good question.
And that question led him to conduct a more controlled experiment in the lab.
Okay, so he took it indoors.
He did, and he designed this setup with 4 interconnected pens.
Kind of like a maze, but for rats.
Yeah, sort of, but with a very specific purpose in mind.
Which was?
He wanted to see what would happen when the rats were basically forced into constant close contact.
Oh, I see, to really ramp up the crowding factor.
Exactly. So he let the population in these pens grow to about double the normal density.
How many rats are we talking here?
Around 80.
Okay, and that?
And then he held it steady at that level for 16 months.
16 months? That's a long time for a rat study.
It is, but it was long enough to see some really significant changes in their behavior pattern.
Okay, so what happened?
Well, this is where things start to get really interesting.
Okay.
The 2 end pens, which he called pens 1 and 4,
Right.
they only had one entrance and exit,
Okay,
which kind of created a natural bottleneck.
I see.
What he observed in those pens was, I guess you could say, almost predictable.
In what way?
Well, these dominant males emerged pretty quickly.
Oh, of course, alpha rats.
Exactly. And each one basically controlled their own pen.
Like little kings,
Yeah, pretty much.
guarding their territory.
Oh, yeah, like a bouncer at an exclusive club.
Hmm.
Each of these dominant males also had his own harem.
A harem of female rats.
Yep, usually about 8 to 12 females each.
Wow, living the dream.
Right. So life in those end pens was actually pretty stable.
Okay.
The females were raising their young successfully,
Uh-huh.
and about half of the pups survived to adulthood.
Which is normal, I guess.
Yeah, pretty average for rats in a good environment.
So those rats were doing all right then.
Yeah, all things considered, they were doing okay.
But that's not the whole story, is it?
No, it's not. And this is where things take a bit of a dark turn.
Oh, what happened?
In the two middle pens, pens 2 and 3,
Yeah.
something completely different unfolded.
And this was because...
Well, remember how these pens were designed for constant, unavoidable contact?
Right, yeah.
So there was really no escape from all the social pressures?
I'm guessing that's what led to the pathology part of the title.
Bingo. Calhoun actually called these middle pens the behavioral sink.
The behavioral sink.
Yeah, not exactly a cheerful name.
So what happened in the behavioral sink?
Well, before we get into that, think about it this way.
Okay.
If you forced to live in this constantly crowded environment,
Mm-hmm.
no escape from all those people, all that social interaction,
Yeah, I can see how that would be stressful.
right, would you thrive?
I don't know, maybe.
Or would you start to exhibit some, let's say, unusual behaviors?
Ooh, good question.
Keep that question in mind as we dive into the behavioral sink.
Okay,
Because what happened to those rats might be more relatable than you think.
I'm ready. Let's hear it. Okay, so let's dive into this behavioral sink. This is where things get really interesting, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is where we see the really bizarre and sometimes disturbing effects of crowding.
That again, like, it's not even that there were like thousands of rats crammed in there.
Right.
The population was controlled, remember?
Yep, about 80 rats.
But it was that constant social pressure, like always being around other rats.
No escape.
Yeah, exactly. No escape. And it seemed to just trigger this cascade of, well, Calhoun called them pathological behaviors.
Yeah, meaning like outside the normal range of what you'd see in a healthy rat population.
Right. And he observed like 4 main types of these pathological behaviors.
Okay, let's hear 'em.
So the first one, and maybe the most obvious, was aggression.
Makes sense. I mean, rats fight.
They do. And a certain amount of aggression is totally natural, especially among the males, competing for dominance and all that.
Yeah, but in the behavioral sink, it was like the aggression was dialed up to 11.
Exactly. Fights were happening way more often, and they were much more severe, like really brutal.
And these were the dominant males, right? The ones who were used to being in charge.
Yeah, and they were constantly being challenged, like their authority was always under threat.
I can see how that would be stressful.
Oh, yeah, super stressful. And Calhoun actually describes some of these dominant males going completely berserk.
Berserk? Like how?
Attacking anyone in sight, even biting tails, which is apparently pretty unusual for rats.
Really?
Yeah, so it's like that constant pressure, that inability to escape the crowd, just pushed them over the edge.
Wow. It makes you wonder if there are any parallels to human behavior,
It does, doesn't it?
Like, think about road rage incidents or how some people just seem to snap in crowded situations.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Like, maybe there's a limit to how much social pressure we can handle before we start to lose it.
Possibly. But here's the thing. Aggression was only one side of the coin.
Oh. What else was going on?
Calhoun also saw a strange increase in submissiveness.
Really? So the opposite of aggression.
Exactly. And he describes some of these submissive males as physically healthy. Like their fur was sleek, no signs of fighting, but they were total social misfits. Like they'd just wander around in a daze, withdrawn, unresponsive to everything.
Like they'd given up.
Yeah, almost like they'd given up on trying to navigate all the social complexity of the behavioral sink.
It's like the crowding just overloaded their capacity to cope.
Exactly. And it's fascinating how the same stressful environment could produce these totally opposite reactions, right?
Right. Extreme aggression in some rats and complete withdrawal in others.
And there was another group of submissive males that Calhoun called probers.
Probers, what were they like?
These guys were constantly on the move, hypersexual, and completely disregarded normal social norms.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, they'd invade nests, sometimes even exhibiting cannibalistic behaviors towards the young.
Whoa, hold on. Cannibalism.
Yeah, it's like their behavior was driven by this insatiable need for stimulation, but it was totally out of sync with normal rat behavior.
Like the crowding had scrambled their instincts or something?
It's possible. Yeah, okay, so we've got aggression, withdrawal, cannibalism, and it gets even weirder.
Oh, no. Lay it on me.
Calhoun also observed a lot of what he called sexual deviance.
Like what?
Well, the probers we were just talking about, they wouldn't follow typical mating rituals.
Okay.
And then there were these pansexual males. They'd try to mate indiscriminately with anyone, regardless of age or sex.
Like all social boundaries had just broken down?
Yeah, exactly. The rules that normally regulate behavior just went out the window.
And I'm guessing this breakdown extended to the females as well.
It did. Remember how we were talking about nest building being like a crucial instinct for rats, especially for mothers about to give birth?
Right, it's essential.
Well, in the behavioral sync, the females started to lose this ability. Like they'd start building a nest and then just abandon it.
Really?
Yeah, and they collect less and less nesting material. Eventually, many of them were giving birth directly on the bare floor of the pen.
Oh, that's awful. Poor pups.
Yeah, and of course this had a devastating impact on their survival.
I can only imagine.
The infant mortality rate in those middle pens was somewhere between 80 and 96%.
That's heartbreaking.
It is, and the mothers would often just abandon their young or even drop them while transporting them.
So it wasn't just the lack of nests, they were neglecting their babies too.
It seems that way, and it really highlights how crowding doesn't just affect individuals. You know, it can disrupt the very fabric of social behavior, even the most fundamental instincts like maternal care.
And wasn't it also that the females were under constant stress from all those overactive males?
Absolutely. Like, females in heat were relentlessly pursued by large groups of males, which led to pregnancies with complications and serious health problems.
So basically everyone was miserable.
Pretty much, yeah. It was a bleak situation.
But before we all just decide that rats are crazy,
Right.
it's important to remember that Calhoun himself was super cautious about drawing direct comparisons between rats and humans.
Yeah, he understood that animal research has its limitations.
But he also saw some pretty compelling parallels, right?
He did, and actually, there's a growing body of research on the effects of crowding on humans, and some of it really does echo what Calhoun observed in his rats.
Okay, so what are we talking about here?
Well, let's talk about prisons for a second.
Okay.
There was this study that looked at extremely overcrowded prisons, like where inmates barely had 50 square feet of personal space.
50 square feet, that's tiny.
It is, and what they found was pretty disturbing.
Like what?
These overcrowded prisons had significantly higher rates of death, violence, suicide, illness, even disciplinary problems.
Wow, so basically just a more volatile and stressful environment.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, with prisons, there are a lot of other factors at play, too.
Right, like the nature of the crimes, pre-existing mental health conditions, the whole prison environment itself.
But it does suggest that crowding can amplify existing tensions and make a bad situation even worse.
And it's not just about aggression either, right?
Well, there have been studies showing that crowding can mess with our cognitive abilities.
Really? So like making it harder to think straight.
Exactly. There was this one study where they had people complete these complex tasks in these small, crowded rooms,
Okay.
and their performance just tanked compared to those who had more space.
So if you want to ace that exam, maybe don't cram for it in a packed library.
Probably good advice, yeah. And don't forget about the physiological effects.
Right, like our bodies react to crowding too.
Yeah, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure increases, you start perceiving others as more hostile.
Like your body's going into fight or flight mode.
Kind of, yeah. And even your perception of time can get distorted.
Interesting.
Like it makes everything feel like it's dragging on forever.
Ugh, it's like your body's in this constant state of low-grade panic.
Yeah, pretty much not exactly the recipe for a relaxing study session.
Or anything, really.
True, but here's where things get really interesting. Remember that study we mentioned earlier, the one in New York City?
The one that found no link between population density and social problems.
Yeah, that one. So are we saying crowding doesn't matter for humans?
I mean, that seems to contradict everything we've just talked about.
Well, not necessarily. It might be more nuanced than that.
Okay, hell his thing.
Maybe it's not just about the sheer number of people, but the type of crowding, the context, and how we perceive and cope with it.
All right, so walk me through these nuances.
Well, there's a growing body of research on what's called household density.
Household density, okay.
And it seems that having too many people crammed into small homes is linked to increased mental health risks, like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
Whoa, really? That's kind of scary.
It is, and it raises a lot of questions, like, is it the stress of constant close contact, the lack of privacy, or maybe even something like increased exposure to infections in a crowded household?
It's like a whole new set of factors to consider.
Exactly. And one study offered a particularly interesting perspective that kind of challenges our assumptions about crowding. So this study found that, like, up to a certain point, having more people in a home was actually linked to less social withdrawal and aggression.
Really?
Yeah, and it was only when the number of people like exceeded the number of rooms in the house that things kind of flipped.
Huh. So it's like there's this tipping point where density goes from maybe even being beneficial to straight up detrimental.
Right, and it really makes you think, like, is it actually the density itself causing the problems, or are people with certain personality types just naturally drawn to living in more crowded environments? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like the chicken and egg question.
Totally. And it highlights just how complex this whole issue really is. We can't just look at numbers. Like, we have to consider individual differences, cultural norms, the specific dynamics of each environment. It's a lot.
It seems like we've come a long way from those rats in Calhoun's little Utopia, but it's amazing how relevant his work still is. Like, it really made us stop and think about crowding in this whole new way.
Yeah. Calhoun was a true pioneer.
For sure.
And while we might not be able to draw perfect parallels between rats in a lab and humans in the real world, like, his research really sparked this wave of inquiry that's still going strong today.
So the big takeaway from our deep dive, I think it's safe to say that crowding matters.
Absolutely.
But the how and the why are still very much open for exploration.
And that's what makes this field so fascinating. You know, like, we're constantly refining our understanding, peeling back the layers of complexity, asking new questions.
Speaking of questions, here's one for you to ponder.
Okay, shoot.
If Calhoun were alive today, what aspects of crowding do you think he'd be most interested in studying?
Ooh, that's a good one. I don't know. Would he be fascinated by, like, mega cities where you have millions of people living in such close proximity? Or maybe he'd be studying the dynamics of online social networks where we're constantly bombarded with information and interactions. It's like a whole new form of crowding.
Right. And what about the way we pack ourselves into airplanes and stadiums for hours at a time? It's like his research on physical space might have some unexpected applications to these modern forms of crowding.
It's definitely a thought-provoking question.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. What aspects of crowding stand out to you? How do you think Calhoun's findings relate to our world today?
Yeah, chime in.
Share your insights on our website. Find us on social media. This conversation doesn't end here.
Exactly.
We're all part of this ongoing exploration of human behavior. Every perspective, every question just adds another piece to the puzzle.